I begged my aunt to hire an estate attorney. She used a free will template instead, and now her disabled son's future is in ruins. Posted by you/throwaway 15473268. My name is Chuck. I'm 42, an accountant, and I've always been the go-to guy in my extended family for taxes, finances, and anything involving forms or money. I'm not a lawyer, and I've never claimed to be one, but I know enough about estate planning to know when someone is about to make a terrible mistake. And unfortunately, my Aunt Eleanor didn't listen to me. She died last year, and I've spent the last few months watching her carefully built life unravel. Not because she didn't care, but because she chose the wrong way to show it. Aunt Eleanor was 82 when she passed. She was a widow and had been for nearly 30 years. Her husband left her the house, some investments, and life insurance. She lived simply and saved well, turning what could have been a modest retirement into an estate worth about $2 million. Half of that was her house, the other half was spread across bank accounts, CDs, and a solid stock portfolio. She had 2 sons, Pete, 53, and Nate, 56. Pete has always been different, and I say that with nothing but love. He's developmentally disabled, born with cognitive delays that made certain things harder for him from day one. As kids, the rest of us would be outside playing tag or riding bikes, and Pete would be sitting on the porch with Aunt Eleanor, carefully sorting his toy cars into rows by color or size. He liked order, still does, but while the rest of us outgrew picture books and bedtime stories, Pete held on to them a little longer. A lot longer, really. He wasn't diagnosed with anything specific back in the 70s, just labeled slow by school administrators who didn't know what else to call it. But it was more than that. Pete struggled with short-term memory, complex instructions, and reading comprehension. Numbers confused him. Abstract ideas didn't land. Aunt Eleanor once told me, "He understands love better than he understands clocks." And I thought that was about the most accurate thing I'd ever heard. Then there was the fall. He was in his 20s and helping a neighbor clean out gutters when the ladder slipped. He broke his ankle and his hip, and while he technically recovered, he never really walked the same way again. His balance was off and he had a slight limp from then on. He started using a cane, first just on rainy days, but eventually all the time. He tired easily and needed help with things like stairs and uneven sidewalks. Aunt Eleanor installed handrails all over the house, and every so often, she'd quietly ask me to measure how much money she had left in her emergency fund, just in case Pete ever needs a ramp or a chair lift. Pete's legally competent, which is a technical term that makes lawyers feel better but doesn't really reflect the daily reality. Yes, he can sign his name and understand simple decisions. But managing money? Not a chance. He once gave a telemarketer access to his checking account because he thought he was signing up for a new flashlight subscription. And don't even get me started on the time he tried to return a refund check to the DMV because he didn't remember why they sent it. He's been on disability since his early 30s, and he relies on it entirely. The monthly checks aren't much, but they cover his personal expenses. His health care is through a government program that Eleanor fought like hell to get him approved for. She filled out every form, waited on hold for hours, and drove across the county to hand-deliver paperwork to people who would have lost it if she'd mailed it. She once told me, "I don't sleep unless I know Petey's covered for his prescriptions next month." He's lived with her in that same house since he was born. Never had his own apartment, never stayed overnight anywhere else unless it was a hospital. That home was his entire universe. Every photograph, every rug, every creaky floorboard was familiar to him. Eleanor had a way of making the world feel safe for him. She color-coded the pantry, labeled drawers with big block letters, and left post-it notes on the fridge reminding him of things like, "Turn off the stove," and "Don't answer the door without asking who it is." Once, a few years ago, I visited and found him sitting in the living room, meticulously organizing a stack of coupons into categories that made sense only to him. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "I'm helping Mom save money. We need the good ones for toilet paper and the dentist." That's Pete. He wanted to contribute. He wanted to help. But without Eleanor, the truth is, he wouldn't last a month on his own. And now she's gone. Nate was the opposite of Pete in just about every way. Pete was trusting and easygoing, someone who wore his heart on his sleeve. Nate, on the other hand, was sharp, cynical, and angry at the world before he even had a reason to be. If Pete floated gently through life, Nate clawed his way through it, fists up and ready for a fight even when no one was swinging. When we were kids, I always thought Nate was the smartest one in the room. He picked up on things quickly, had a head for numbers, and could argue his way into or out of just about anything. But there was always something simmering under the surface, like he resented being part of a family that didn't work the way he thought it should. That resentment only grew with age. By the time he was in his 30s, he was constantly talking about how the world was against him. His boss was incompetent, his coworkers were lazy, the government was broken, and don't even get him started on family dynamics. He had a particular bitterness toward Pete that none of us could fully understand. On the outside, he'd chalk it up to fairness, how Pete got everything handed to him while Nate had to work for everything. But it went deeper than that. I think Nate hated how easily people loved Pete. Pete didn't challenge anyone. He didn't criticize. He didn't dominate a conversation. He just smiled and listened, and somehow people were drawn to that. Nate saw it as weakness, and it infuriated him that kindness and simplicity earned Pete affection that Nate never seemed to receive. It wasn't always like that. When they were younger, Nate would actually defend Pete from bullies. I remember one time in middle school, a kid made fun of Pete for wearing Velcro shoes, and Nate threw the kid's lunch tray across the cafeteria. But as adults, something shifted. Nate started treating Pete not as someone to protect, but as competition. And when he didn't feel like he was winning, he withdrew. 15 years ago, Nate cut himself off. No warning, no big blowout, just silence. Aunt Eleanor told me he stopped returning her calls, then blocked her number entirely. He left the state, changed emails, stopped showing up for holidays. I tried once to check in on him, sent a message through an old email address, and got a one-sentence reply. "Don't play mediator, Chuck." That was the last time I heard from him until everything with the estate happened. Physically, Nate was still the same when I last saw him. Tall, clean-shaven, with that same intense stare that made you feel like he was dissecting every word you said. But he carried himself with the cold detachment of someone who had made peace with his own isolation. He didn't want reconciliation. He wanted distance, control, autonomy, and as far as any of us knew back then, he had it. He didn't need us, didn't want us, and most of all, he didn't want to be bothered with anything that didn't serve him directly. Aunt Eleanor used to say, "Nate was born with a map in his head, but he refuses to share the destination." I think what she meant was, he always thought he had it all figured out. He just didn't care if anyone else came along for the ride. So, no, we didn't expect Nate to be involved in anything when Eleanor passed. He had made it clear a long time ago. He didn't want a role in the family. He'd already fired himself. The trouble started about 3 years ago when Aunt Eleanor pulled me aside after dinner and said she was getting her will together. I told her I could recommend a fantastic estate planning attorney, someone who specialized in special needs planning. She scoffed. "Oh, Chuck, I don't need to pay thousands of dollars for a lawyer to tell me what I already know. Pete's going to get everything. Nate's out of the picture. And I found a will template online that even has space for a trust. I'm just going to write it all out." I pleaded with her to reconsider. I even offered to pay for the attorney myself. She just waved it off. "It's not worth it. I'm not giving it to anyone strange. I'm naming you as trustee. I trust you." I left that conversation feeling like I just watched someone build a house out of dry leaves and strike a match nearby. What I didn't know was how she'd handled the execution. Eleanor asked the grandson of her neighbor to help her download and fill out the form. His name is Kyle. He's in his 20s, knows his way around the internet, and thought he was doing something helpful. He told me later she had very specific instructions. Pete was to be the sole beneficiary, and his share was to go into a special needs trust to preserve his benefits. She wrote it all out, named me as trustee, and crossed Nate's name out from a draft copy with a thick black marker. Kyle printed the document. Eleanor signed it at her neighbor Dolores' house, with Kyle and Dolores as the witnesses. A mobile notary came over and notarized the will. According to the notary, Eleanor insisted that "It's just a formality," and brushed off the notary's warning that the form's language might not meet our state's legal requirements for a valid will. Dolores passed away about 6 months later. Natural causes, just old age. Then, 5 months after that, Eleanor died of a stroke. Pete found her in her recliner, peaceful, quiet, gone. I flew out the next day to help Pete with arrangements. He was devastated. His entire world had revolved around her. When he handed me the will and said, "Mom said you'd take care of everything," I nearly broke down. The will looked okay at a glance. Pete was listed as the sole beneficiary. It directed that his inheritance be held in a testamentary supplemental needs trust, with me as trustee. The problem wasn't the content. It was the format. The notary section didn't include the self-proving affidavit language required by state law. That meant the witnesses would have to sign separate affidavits stating they witnessed Eleanor sign the will. But one of the two witnesses, Dolores, was already deceased. That made it impossible to comply with the state's rules. We submitted the will to probate anyway, hoping the court would accept it based on its intent. They didn't. The probate court rejected the will outright. The missing affidavit from Dolores and the defective notarization meant it wasn't self-proving, and under our state's law, that made the will invalid. Without a valid will, Eleanor's estate would be distributed according to intestacy laws. In this case, that meant her two sons would split the estate evenly. I was stunned. So was Pete. But the law was clear. Now Pete was inheriting $1 million directly, and that was a huge problem. Because Pete is legally competent, the court couldn't assign his inheritance to a trust or delay his access to it. It would be disbursed to him directly, unless he disclaimed it. But if he did, it would go to Nate. Here's where it gets worse. If Pete accepted the inheritance, he would lose his disability benefits and his government-paid health insurance. That money would count as income and assets, and he'd be over the limit to qualify. He could spend it down, yes, but once it was gone, he'd have to reapply and start from scratch. Could take years. There's no guarantee he'd be approved again. He'd be on his own financially and medically during that time. He could try to take the house and only half of the liquid assets, $500,000, but that would barely be enough to sustain him for the rest of his life. The house is old and needs maintenance. Medical expenses go up every year, and Pete doesn't have the skills or knowledge to manage that kind of financial responsibility. I asked him what he wanted to do. He said, "I just want to stay here. I want things to stay how they were." He didn't understand the full scope of the disaster. I don't blame him. And then, of course, Nate showed up. He hadn't been at the funeral, hadn't spoken to Eleanor in over a decade. But somehow, he found out there was money to be had, and within days, he showed up to claim his half of the estate. When I asked him if he'd consider putting some of his share into a trust to help Pete keep his benefits, he laughed. "This is what happens when people cheap out," he said. "Mom was always like that, reusing napkins, refusing to replace the fridge. And now she tried to save a few bucks by not hiring a lawyer, and it blew up in her face. I'm taking my money and leaving." I offered to split my time helping Pete manage his money. I even considered trying to get a court to assign a conservator or petition to create a special needs trust post-inheritance. But because Pete is competent and over 18, that wasn't going to work. And there was no legal way to make Nate contribute or cooperate. The house was valued at about $500,000. Pete chose to keep it. He couldn't imagine leaving it. That left him with $500,000 in liquid assets. I helped him set up a financial advisor with experience working with disabled clients, and we're trying to make the money stretch. But realistically, it won't be enough. Not for the next 20 to 30 years of his life. He's already off his benefits. We had to file to cancel his SSDI. Medicaid dropped him once the inheritance showed up in his name. He's paying out of pocket now, and it's already eating into his cash. Nate burned through his share in under a year. Bought a truck he can't drive, took a vacation, paid off debts, and disappeared again. I don't expect we'll hear from him until Pete's money runs out and he smells an opportunity. We spoke to another attorney to see if anything could be done retroactively. Maybe a constructive trust? Maybe a petition for equitable relief? The attorney told us, gently, that there was no legal basis. The will had been rejected. Eleanor's intent, no matter how clear, was not enough. It was too late. This whole nightmare started because Eleanor didn't want to spend a few $1,000s on an estate attorney. That's all it would have taken to protect Pete's benefits, his home, and his long-term security. But she thought a free template and a mobile notary would do the job. I've talked to so many families about this now. I tell them Eleanor's story. I tell them about Pete. I don't use their real names, but I share the warning. When you're planning for a disabled beneficiary, you don't have room for mistakes. One wrong move, one invalid form, one dead witness, and you can unravel decades of love and care in an instant. Pete will be okay for a few years, maybe longer if we're lucky, but eventually the money will run out. And when it does, he'll have no home, no benefits, and no way to get back what he lost. All because the estate plan was free. Please, if you're reading this and you think you can skip the lawyer because your wishes are simple, don't. Nothing is simple when the law is involved, especially when someone vulnerable is counting on you. Don't let your family become the story.
This story was fictional, but it highlights some of the chaos that can happen in actual estates. If you want to plan your estate the right way, get your free ebook at www.estateplanningebook.com.